On a humid August night in 1851, in the tobacco country of Southside, Virginia, a slave trader's ledger recorded a transaction that would later become the subject of rumor, fear, and contradiction. The entry was unusually detailed. A 19-year-old enslaved person purchased in Charleston, noted for uncommon physical traits, priced far above the standard market rate. The buyer was Thomas Ruddled, owner of Belmont Estate. Within 14 months of that purchase, 3 people would be dead, a prosperous plantation would fall into ruin, and most written records connected to the estate would be deliberately destroyed. Official documents from Prince Edward County later confirmed that Belmont was sold at a fraction of its value in late 1852, with unusual legal instructions. Certain rooms were to remain permanently sealed. Yet despite the absence of formal records, fragments survived. Letters, diaries, and private notes from the period of 17 in total refer obliquely to what became known as the Ruddled incident. None of them agree on exactly what happened. All of them agree that something did. Belmont Estate. Before the collapse, Belmont Estate stood as one of the larger properties in Prince Edward County, tens of thousands of acres of tobacco fields, forest, and labor quarters. It had been in the Ruddled family since the late 18th century. Thomas Ruddled, now in his late 30s, inherited the estate after his father's death along with significant debts. He was known locally as disciplined and pragmatic, neither unusually cruel nor especially kind by the standards of the plantation system. His world was built on control, order, and inheritance. His wife, Catherine Ruddled, came from a wealthy merchant family in Richmond. Once socially admired for her beauty and refinement, she had grown increasingly withdrawn after the stillbirth of her child in 1849. She spent most of her days isolated in the upper rooms of the mansion. By outward appearance, Belmont functioned like any other estate: church attendance, social visits, agricultural management, and strict hierarchy over the 40-odd enslaved people who lived and worked there. But beneath that structure was a growing emotional and financial instability that few outsiders noticed. The arrival of the enslaved person in August 1851, a slave trader named Samuel Wickham arrived at Belmont with a proposal. He described a young enslaved person recently acquired from Charleston, educated, trained in reading and writing, and possessing what he called unusual biological characteristics that made the individual medically noteworthy. Wickham's tone was less concerned with humanity than with rarity, presenting the person as a curiosity and investment. After initial hesitation, Thomas agreed to see the individual. The enslaved person, referred to in records only as Jordan, appeared young, quiet, and carefully controlled in demeanor. Their identity did not conform to the rigid categories of the time, something the trader emphasized as a medical anomaly. Jordan spoke formally, stating they were trained to obey and accustomed to examination and instruction. Thomas, unsettled yet intrigued, made a decision that would alter the course of the estate. He purchased Jordan immediately. The beginning of obsession. Jordan was first housed in a small cottage near the main house, away from the slave quarters. Within days, both Thomas and Catherine developed a fixation on the individual, though in different ways. Catherine's interest began as curiosity, shaped by grief and emotional isolation. She studied Jordan closely, asking questions, observing, and attempting to understand what she saw as an existence that defied ordinary categories. Thomas, meanwhile, became absorbed in medical texts and personal notes, attempting to rationalize what he could not easily classify. Soon, Jordan was moved into the main house under Catherine's supervision. Officially, they were assigned domestic duties, but in practice, they existed in isolation from both the enslaved community and the social world of the household. What began as curiosity deepened into obsession. The house begins to change over the following weeks. The estate began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Thomas grew distracted, neglecting plantation management. Catherine withdrew almost entirely from public life. The plantation's enslaved community noticed changes in routine, discipline, and attention. Work continued, but leadership weakened. Jordan moved silently between spaces, speaking little unless addressed, maintaining a calm and controlled presence that unsettled many who observed them. Among the enslaved workers, rumors began to circulate, some fearful, some superstitious, all attempting to explain what no one fully understood. Harriet, the household cook, observed the changes most clearly. She saw the growing disintegration of both master and mistress, and the strange emotional dependence they seemed to develop toward Jordan. She also saw Jordan's increasing isolation and resignation, growing instability as autumn progressed. The plantation began to falter. Financial records were neglected. Harvest coordination broke down. Social obligations were ignored. Neighbors began to notice Thomas's absence from public affairs and Catherine's disappearance from society. Inside the house, Catherine and Thomas increasingly revolved their lives around Jordan, each in their own way, projecting meaning, need, and interpretation onto a person who remained largely unreadable and detached. Jordan, meanwhile, appeared to adapt to survival through emotional distance, offering responses that were measured and restrained, revealing little of inner thought. To the enslaved community, Jordan became both visible and unreachable, present within the house but socially severed from every group. Breakdown of order. By October, the plantation structure had weakened significantly. 2 enslaved laborers attempted to escape and were forcibly returned, resulting in punishment administered by Thomas. Witnesses later described his behavior as detached, almost absent, as if routine discipline no longer held meaning for him. That same period marked increasing tension within the household itself. Raised voices were heard between Thomas and Catherine. Their shared fixation, once quiet and mutual, began to fracture under strain neither could articulate. Jordan remained central to both their attention, but no longer stabilized their emotional states. Instead, the presence that had once drawn them together now seemed to deepen instability. Collapse of the household. By November, Belmont Estate was in visible decline. Fields were unattended, financial obligations ignored, and social ties effectively severed. The plantation functioned only because enslaved workers maintained basic operations themselves. Catherine had become nearly fully withdrawn from public life. Thomas alternated between lethargy and obsessive documentation, trait that he eventually stopped writing altogether. Jordan remained physically unchanged in role, quiet, obedient, and isolated, but increasingly viewed by others as a symbol of the household's collapse rather than its cause. Among the enslaved community, sympathy and fear intertwined. Some attempted brief acts of kindness or communication, but Jordan remained emotionally distant, expressing acceptance of their condition without expectation of change. Final descent. By late November, Belmont Estate no longer functioned as a coherent household. The master and mistress were effectively absorbed into their own private fixation, while the plantation itself continued only through the labor and coordination of those enslaved upon it. The social structure had inverted, authority weakened, communication fractured, and meaning dissolved into routine survival. Jordan, when asked about escape or change, responded with quiet resignation, acknowledging that their difference would always mark them, wherever they went. Aftermath. Historical records confirm that within months, Belmont Estate was sold under unusual conditions. Portions of the house were sealed. Documents were destroyed. The Ruddled family name disappeared from local prominence. What remained were fragments, letters, rumors, and incomplete accounts, none of which fully agree on what occurred inside the estate during that final year. Some describe obsession. Others describe grief and collapse. A few suggest something stranger, that the true tragedy was not any single event, but the way isolation, power, and fixation gradually dismantled an entire household from within. What is certain is that Belmont Estate did not survive the winter of 1851 unchanged. "That's terrible," Catherine whispered. "Yes, mistress, it is." It was during one of these long afternoons that Catherine finally articulated the question that had been growing in her mind for months. "Do you hate us, Thomas and me?" Jordan was silent for a long moment. When the slave finally spoke, it was with careful consideration, as if weighing each word. "Hate requires a kind of freedom I don't have, mistress. To hate you, I would have to believe I deserved something different, that I had a right to be treated as fully human. But I was taught from childhood that I don't have that right, that my unusual nature makes me something less than human, something to be studied and displayed. So no, I don't hate you. I don't. I simply endure you the same way I've endured everyone before you, and will endure everyone who comes after." Catherine began to cry, then deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere fundamental. Jordan sat motionless, offering no comfort, simply bearing witness to the mistress's breakdown with that same careful neutrality. When Catherine finally composed herself, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red. "I think we're destroying ourselves," she said. Thomas and I, this obsession with you, it's like a disease eating us from the inside. Yes, mistress, and you're just watching it happen. What else can I do? Catherine had no answer. The crisis that had been building for months finally came to a head on December 15th when Dr. Edmund Carriel arrived at Belmont Estate. Dr. Carriel was a physician from Richmond, an old friend of Thomas's father, who had written to Thomas weeks earlier, offering condolences on some business difficulties he'd heard about through mutual acquaintances. Thomas, in a moment of weakness and desperate need to validate his obsession, had written back mentioning his acquisition of a medical curiosity and inviting Carlyle to visit and offer his professional opinion. He arrived in the afternoon, a rotund man in his 60s, with white mutton chops and the confident bearing of someone who had spent 40 years being deferred to as an authority. Thomas greeted him with an enthusiasm that seemed forced, almost manic. Catherine remained upstairs, claiming a headache. They dined together that evening, and Thomas spoke, with barely controlled excitement, about Jordan, carefully at first, using medical terminology and discussing the rarity of true hermaphroditism, but gradually becoming more animated, more revealing of his fascination. Carlyle listened with professional interest that slowly shifted to something more troubled as the evening progressed. "I would be very interested to examine this slave," Carriel said finally. "If you're amenable, of course. That's why I invited you. I value your expertise, your professional assessment of the situation." Something in Thomas's voice made Carriel pause. "The situation?" Thomas seemed to catch himself. "The medical condition, I mean the documentation from the previous owner, was extensive, but I would appreciate a second opinion from someone of your standing." After dinner, Thomas brought Carlyle to Jordan's room. Catherine was already there, sitting in her chair by the window, looking like a wraith in her dark dress. Jordan stood by the door, hands clasped, face, carefully neutral. "This is Jordan," Thomas said, his voice taking on that clinical tone he used when trying to maintain distance from his obsession. "The slave I mentioned in my letter." Carlyle approached Jordan with professional detachment, asking questions about age, general health, the slave's history before coming to Belmont. Jordan answered in that careful, rehearsed manner, providing information without inflection or emotion. "May I conduct a brief physical examination?" Carriel asked. "Nothing invasive, simply an external observation to assess the condition Mr. Ruddle described." Jordan glanced at Thomas, who nodded. "Of course, doctor." Jordan is accustomed to medical examination. What followed was a professional, respectful assessment that stood in stark contrast to what had been happening in that room for the past 4 months. Carlyle examined Jordan's face, hands, asked the slave to turn slowly, made a few notations in a small book he carried. His examination was thorough, but treating Jordan as a patient rather than a specimen. When he was finished, his expression had shifted from clinical interest to something more complex, a mixture of professional curiosity and deeply personal concern. "Remarkable," he said quietly. "A genuine case of hermaphroditism. Quite rare indeed." He looked at Thomas, then at Catherine, sitting motionless in her chair. "Might I speak with you privately, Mr. Ruddle?" They retired to Thomas's study, leaving Catherine and Jordan alone upstairs. Carriel accepted a brandy and stood by the fire, choosing his words with obvious care. "Thomas, I've known your family for many years. I respected your father despite his difficulties, which is why I must speak frankly now as a friend and as a physician." Thomas felt his stomach tighten with dread. "What is it?" "That slave upstairs is indeed a genuine hermaphrodite. The condition is as rare as you suggested. From a strictly medical standpoint, it would be of considerable interest to researchers." Carriel paused, his eyes grave. "But Thomas, what concerns me is not the slave's condition. What concerns me is the atmosphere in that room. The way you and your wife look at that person, the tension, the obsession I sense beneath your words." Thomas felt his face flush. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you've become dangerously fixated on this slave in a way that goes far beyond medical or scientific interest. Your plantation is failing. I could see that on my way up the drive. Your wife looks like she hasn't slept properly in months. You yourself appear—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Consumed. This isn't healthy, Thomas. Whatever is happening here needs to stop before it destroys you." "Jordan is my property," Thomas said, his voice sharper than he intended. How I choose to manage my property is my concern. There are moral lines, Thomas, even in the treatment of slaves, and I fear you've crossed several of them." The conversation deteriorated. From there, Thomas became defensive, then angry. Carriel remained firm but compassionate, trying to make Thomas see what was happening to him and his wife. But Thomas couldn't or wouldn't hear it. The obsession had its hooks too deep. Carriel left the next morning, troubled and convinced that something terrible was unfolding at Belmont Estate. He considered writing to mutual friends, perhaps even to the county authorities. But what would he report? That a man was too interested in a slave he owned. That wasn't illegal, wasn't even particularly unusual in Virginia in 1851, so Carriel did nothing, and the opportunity to intervene passed. After his departure, Thomas and Catherine didn't speak about the visit, but something had shifted. Carriel's words had forced them to confront, however briefly, what they were doing, and that confrontation didn't lead to change. It led to desperation, to a doubling down on the obsession, as if by consuming themselves entirely in it, they could somehow escape the guilt that was beginning to poison everything. January 1852 brought heavy snows that isolated Belmont Estate from the outside world for nearly 3 weeks. The tobacco fields lay dormant under white blankets. The slaves huddled in their quarters around smoky fires, and inside the main house, Thomas and Catherine descended further into a darkness that neither could any longer deny or escape. The isolation seemed to accelerate everything. With no social obligations to maintain, no appearances to keep up, they abandoned whatever restraint had remained. Thomas stopped even pretending to manage the plantation. Catherine stopped leaving the 3rd floor entirely. And Jordan simply endured, as always, existing in that strange liminal space between person and object, between the living and those who merely survived. But something had changed in Jordan too. The slave had begun to speak more often, not with defiance exactly, but with a kind of quiet observation that made Thomas and Catherine increasingly uncomfortable. Jordan had learned that speaking could create cracks in their certainty, could introduce doubt into their carefully constructed rationalizations. "You're hurting each other now, not just me," Jordan said one evening after Catherine had left the room in tears following an argument with Thomas. "The obsession is eating you both from the inside." Thomas, exhausted and disheveled, looked at the slave with something close to hatred. "What do you want from me? Some acknowledgement that I've wronged you? Your property, Jordan. You exist to serve whatever purpose I determine. Is that what you tell yourself, master? Because from where I stand, it seems like I'm the only free person in this room. You and the mistress are enslaved to your desires, to your need to possess something you can never truly have. I submit to you because the law gives me no choice. But you submit to your obsessions because you've lost the ability to choose anything else." The words struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Thomas raised his hand as if to strike, then let it fall. What punishment could he inflict that would restore the power dynamic that had already collapsed? What threat could he make that would give him back the control he had lost? He left the room without another word. February brought a thunder but no relief from the tension inside Belmont Estate. The enslaved people in the quarters whispered constantly now, their speculation growing darker and more accurate. Several had begun trying to arrange escapes, knowing that something was terribly wrong and wanting to be far away when whatever was building finally exploded. Harriet refused to bring food to the 3rd floor anymore, forcing Catherine to fetch meals herself or go hungry. 2 more field hands attempted to run and were caught, but Thomas barely seemed to notice when they were returned. The overseer handled the punishment without consulting him, increasingly taking control of day-to-day operations. As the master retreated further into his obsession, Catherine had begun to waste away visibly. She ate almost nothing, slept only in brief, fitful intervals, spent every waking moment either in Jordan's room or pacing the halls like a ghost. Her friends from the charitable societies, concerned by her long absence, sent notes that went unanswered. The minister came again and was turned away at the door. "I see myself in you," Catherine told Jordan one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither one thing nor another, neither fully alive nor fully dead, trapped in some impossible space between. "No, mistress," Jordan replied quietly. "You see what you want to see. I'm just a person. Born different, yes, but still just a person. It's you and the master who made me into something else. You turned me into a symbol of your own confusion. your own sense of being lost. Catherine's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. But you are lost too. We're all lost, perhaps. But I was lost long before I came to Belmont Estate. You chose this. That's the difference. The household staff noticed the change in the mistress. Delia, passing Catherine in the hallway one morning, was shocked by what she saw. The woman had become skeletal, her eyes sunken and wild, her hair hanging loose and unwashed. She moved like someone already half dead, stumbling from one moment to the next without any sense of purpose or direction. Thomas was little better. He had stopped shaving, stopped changing his clothes regularly. He would wander the house at odd hours, muttering to himself, sometimes standing outside Jordan's door for long minutes without ever knocking. The servants learned to avoid him, to make themselves invisible when he passed, because there was something unpredictable in his manner now, something that suggested he might shatter at the slightest provocation. The whispers in the slave quarters had evolved from speculation to certainty. Something very terrible was going to happen. Everyone could feel it, that sense of impending disaster that hangs in the air before a storm breaks. People began making preparations, hiding small caches of food, mending shoes in anticipation of running, having quiet conversations about which direction offered the best chance of reaching free territory. It was Harriet who finally tried to intervene. Driven by a sense that if someone didn't do something, blood would be spilled, she found Thomas in his study late one afternoon, staring at nothing, a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. She stood in the doorway, gathering her courage, knowing that what she was about to do could get her sold away or worse. "Master Ruddled," she said quietly, "I need to speak plain with you." He looked up slowly as if coming back from somewhere very far away. "What is it, Harriet?" "This thing you and the mistress got going with that slave, Jordan. It ain't right, sir. And it's killing all three of you. I can see it happening, pray day by day. You got to let that child go. Al Jordan away. Send that slave somewhere else before this whole house comes crashing down." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. She braced herself for his anger, for punishment, for the violence that masters could inflict on slaves who spoke out of turn. But instead, something crumbled in his expression, and for just a moment she saw the truth written plainly on his face. He knew she was right, knew exactly what was happening, and was powerless to stop it. "Get out, Harriet," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Just get out, she left, her heart pounding, knowing she had tried and failed. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the horror in Belmont Estate is about to reach its terrible conclusion. The breaking point came on February 14th, 1852. The day started like any other in that household of slow dissolution. Thomas rose late, disheveled and hollow-eyed. Catherine remained upstairs, having not left the third floor in 3 days. Jordan moved through the routine of survival, fetching water, managing the small tasks that maintained the illusion of normalcy. But something was different. Those who knew Catherine well, and the enslaved women who had served her for years knew her better than anyone, could see that she had reached some kind of breaking point. There was a strange calm about her that morning, a stillness that was more frightening than her usual agitation. Delia noticed it when she passed the mistress in the hallway. Catherine's eyes, usually restless and fevered, had taken on a glassy quality, as if she were looking at something very far away. She moved with deliberate slowness, like someone performing a rehearsed ritual. When Dia offered to bring her tea, Catherine simply shook her head and continued up the stairs without speaking. Harriet noticed it too, and the feeling of dread that had been building in her chest for months suddenly intensified. She found herself praying quietly under her breath as she worked in the kitchen, that whatever was coming would pass quickly and leave the innocent unharmed. By evening, a cold rain had begun to fall, drumming against the windows and turning the world outside into a blur of gray water. The temperature dropped sharply and the wind howled around the corners of the house, making the old structure creak and groan. It felt like the kind of night when terrible things happened, when the normal rules of the world suspended themselves. Thomas sat in his study staring at the fire, drinking whiskey with mechanical regularity. He had stopped trying to understand what had happened to his life, had stopped trying to rationalize or justify. He simply existed in a fog of alcohol and exhaustion, waiting for something he couldn't name. Free. Upstairs, Catherine sat in Jordan's room, watching the slave with an intensity that had become familiar over the months, but had now taken on a desperate edge. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Outside, the rain intensified, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. "I can't do this anymore," she said suddenly, her voice cracking. "I can't wake up one more day in this house, in this life, knowing what we've become." Jordan, sitting on the narrow bed, looked at her with those careful, guarded eyes. "Then leave, mistress. Take what money you can and go somewhere far away. Start over, start over." Catherine laughed, a broken sound with no humor in it. "How do I start over when I carry this with me? When every time I close my eyes I see what we've done, what we've become? You don't understand. There's no starting over from this. There's only ending it." Something in her tone made Jordan sit up straighter, suddenly alert. "Mistress, what do you mean?" "Pretty." Catherine stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Rain lashed against the glass and lightning briefly illuminated her face. Gaunt, haunted, already half dead. "I thought understanding would bring freedom. I thought if I could just comprehend what you are, if I could solve the mystery of your existence, it would somehow solve the mystery of my own emptiness. But it's only made everything worse. You were right. You're just a person, and we turned you into a symbol of our own brokenness. And I can't live with what that makes us." "Catherine." Jordan used the mistress's name for the first time, abandoning the careful formality of slavery. "Whatever you're thinking, stop. Talk to someone. The minister, a doctor, anyone who can help you." "Help me." Catherine's voice rose, taking on a hysterical edge. "Help me what? Forget what we've done to you. Pretend we're decent people. We're not. We're monsters who used another human being to fill the emptiness, free, inside us, and it didn't work. And now I'm hollow all the way through." She moved to the dresser with sudden purpose, opened a drawer, and pulled out something that gleamed dully in the lamplight. A pistol. One of Thomas's father's dueling pistols that she must have taken from the study days ago, hidden here, waiting for this moment. Jordan stood slowly, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Mistress, please put that down." "Why?" Catherine turned to face Jordan, the gun held loosely in her shaking hand. "So we can keep doing this. Keep destroying each other day by day. I'm tired, Jordan. I'm so tired of being alive. So tired of feeling everything and nothing at the same time." Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the house. The lamp flickered wildly, nearly going out, then steadied again. In that moment of darkness, Catherine's face looked like a skull, all sharp angles and hollow eyes. The door burst open. Thomas stood in the doorway, alerted by Catherine's raised, gray voice, water dripping from his coat. He had been standing outside in the rain, she realized, probably for hours, his eyes immediately fixed on the pistol in his wife's hand, and whatever fog of alcohol and despair he'd been living in suddenly cleared. "Catherine, what are you doing?" She turned to look at him, tears streaming down her wasted face, mixing with the lamplight to make her skin seem to glow. "I'm ending it, Thomas. I'm stopping this before it goes any further." Thomas moved into the room, hand outstretched, his voice taking on a careful, gentle quality she hadn't heard in months. "Please, Catherine, whatever you're feeling, we can what?" She laughed, that broken laugh again. "Fix this. Make it right." "There's no making this right, Thomas. We destroyed this person." She gestured toward Jordan with the gun, the barrel wavering wildly. "We destroyed each other. We destroyed everything we touched because we were too broken to do anything else. Don't you see? We're poison. Everything we touch turns sick and dies." Jordan spoke then, voice calm despite the weapon pointed in their direction. "Catherine, you're not a monster. You're a person who made terrible choices. Yes, but you can still choose differently. You can still walk away from this. Both of you can. It's not too late to it is too late." The gun shook violently in Catherine's grip. "It's been too late since the day Thomas brought you here. Maybe it was too late years before that, when I married, a man I didn't love for money I didn't need. When I tried to be someone I wasn't. When I lost the baby and realized I'd never be the person everyone expected me to be. Don't you understand? I can't keep living like this. Every breath is agony. Every moment I'm awake, I see what we are, what we've done, and I can't bear it anymore. Thomas took another step forward, his face pale, his hand still extended. "Catherine, please think about what you're doing." "Think about? I have thought about it," she screamed. "I've thought about nothing else for weeks. This is the only thing that makes sense anymore. The only choice I have left that's really mine." But Catherine had stopped listening to her own words. Her face had taken on a strange serenity, as if she'd finally made peace with the decision that had been building for months, maybe years. The shaking in her hands stopped. The wild look in her eyes calmed to something almost peaceful. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking directly at Jordan. "For Trecho, all of it. For everything we did to you. For what we turned you into. For using you to avoid looking at ourselves." Then, with movements that seemed to happen in slow motion, she turned the gun away from Jordan and toward herself, pressing the barrel under her chin. Amos lunged forward, his fingers grasping for the weapon, but he was too slow, too late, too broken himself to prevent what came next. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small room, seeming to compress the air itself and make the lamplight flare impossibly bright for one frozen instant. Catherine's body fell backward, striking the floor with a terrible finality. Blood began to spread across the floorboards, dark and gleaming in the lamplight, pooling around her head like a grotesque halo. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, making sounds that were barely human, raw grief and horror that transcended language, animal sounds of pain that no words could express. His hands hovered over her body, wanting to touch her, to hold her, but afraid of causing more damage, as if anything he did now could possibly matter. Jordan remained standing by the window, perfectly still, face showing an expression that might have been pity or might have been relief, or might have been nothing at all. Outside, the rain continued to fall and thunder rolled across the dark sky, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. Downstairs, the servants had heard the gunshot. Harriet stood frozen in the kitchen, her worst fears confirmed, her prayers unanswered. Delia sat in her room with her hands over her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. The other slaves gathered in the hallway, whispering urgently, trying to decide what to do, whether to run or stay, whether this was the beginning of something worse or the end of the nightmare they'd been living through. Catherine lived for 17 more hours. The bullet had caused terrible damage, but hadn't killed her immediately, leaving her suspended between life and death, free, in a state beyond consciousness or pain. She lay in her bed while Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering apologies she couldn't hear, begging forgiveness from someone who was already gone, even though her heart still beat. Jordan brought water and clean cloths, tending to both master and dying mistress with quiet efficiency, saying nothing, offering no comfort or judgment. The slaves simply performed the tasks that needed performing, existing in that familiar space of service that required no thought, no feeling, no engagement with the horror unfolding. The household doctor came near midnight, summoned by one of the servants. He examined Catherine, shook his head gravely, and told Thomas there was nothing to be done but wait. The damage was too severe, too deep in the brain. It was a miracle she had survived this long. When Thomas asked if she was suffering, the doctor assured him that no, she was beyond all suffering now, feeling nothing, aware of nothing, already more, say, absent than present. Thomas sent the doctor away and returned to Catherine's bedside, maintaining his vigil through the long, dark hours. He spoke to her, sometimes rambling confessions of guilt and grief, and love that he had never expressed when she could hear them. He told her about his own emptiness, his own brokenness, how he had thought she could fill the void inside him, and had been devastated to discover she was just as hollow as he was. He told her he was sorry for bringing Jordan into their lives, sorry for starting them down a path that could only end in destruction. But mostly he sat in silence, watching the rise and fall of her chest become slower and shallower with each passing hour. As dawn light began to filter through the windows, gray and cold, matching the rain that still fell outside, Catherine's breathing changed one final time. It became labored, rattling, the sound of a body giving up its last hold on life. Thomas leaned close, tears falling onto her pale face, his hand gripping hers with desperate strength. "I'm sorry," he whispered one last time. "For everything, for failing you, for all of it." Her eyes opened briefly, clouded and unfocused, perhaps seeing him one last time, perhaps seeing nothing at all. Her lips moved, forming words without sound, words he would never know, messages that died undelivered. Then she was gone. The terrible rattling breath stopped. Her hand went limp in his. The slight warmth that had remained in her skin began to fade, replaced by the cold that claimed all the dead. Thomas sat with her body for hours after, unable to move, unable to think, unable to feel anything except a vast emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. Not just Catherine, not just himself, but the entire world, the entire universe, everything collapsing into a void that had no bottom and no end. Finally, Jordan spoke from the doorway, voice quiet and neutral. "Master, we need to call for help. The servants, the doctor, someone needs to be told." Thomas looked up at the slave, his face ravaged by grief and guilt, his eyes red from crying, his hands still clutching his dead wife's cooling fingers. And in that moment, unable to bear the weight of his own culpability, he lashed out at the only target available. "This is your fault," he said, his voice flat and dead. "You did this to us. You destroyed everything." Jordan met his gaze steadily, neither flinching nor arguing, simply accepting the accusation with the same careful neutrality that had characterized every interaction. "No, Master, you did this to yourselves. I was just here." The words hung in the air between them, simple, undeniable, devastating in their truth. Thomas had no response. He turned back to Catherine's body and said nothing more. The aftermath unfolded with grim inevitability, each step following logically from what had come before, like a mathematical proof leading to an inescapable conclusion. Thomas claimed Catherine's death was an accident, a tragic, misfortune that occurred while she was handling one of his father's old pistols, not understanding it was loaded. The local magistrate, a man who had known Thomas since childhood, and who understood the complications that suicide created for a respectable family, accepted this explanation with visible relief. He conducted a brief investigation that asked no difficult questions and reached the conclusion everyone wanted. Suicide was shameful, legally complicated, problematic for the church, and for inheritance. Accident was simpler for everyone involved. The funeral was held 3 days later at Christ Church in Farmville, well attended by neighboring planters and their wives who came to pay their respects to one of their own. They stood in the cold rain and spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones about the tragedy of a young woman taken before her time. They remarked on how devastated Thomas appeared, how he had aged years in recent months, how grief had hollowed him out until he seemed barely substantial. They offered their condolences with genuine feeling. These people who had known the Rutages for generations, who had no idea what had really happened behind the closed doors of Belmont Estate. None of them knew the truth, or if some suspected, if they had noticed Thomas's increasing withdrawal from society, Catherine's strange behavior, the whispered rumors that had begun circulating among the enslaved community. They had the good sense not to speak of it. Some questions were better left unasked in Virginia in 1852. Some answers were too disturbing to acknowledge, but the enslaved community knew. They always knew. In the quarters at Belmont and on neighboring plantations, in whispered conversations after the masters had gone to bed, the truth circulated through the invisible network that connected Virginia's enslaved population. The story of what had happened at Belmont Estate spread and grew in the telling, acquiring mythic dimensions as it passed from mouth to mouth, becoming a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power, and what happened when masters treated enslaved people not as human beings but as objects to satisfy their desires. They spoke of Jordan, the strange slave, neither man nor woman, who had somehow driven the Rutages to destruction simply by existing. Some versions of the story suggested Jordan had special powers, some kind of conjure or hoodoo that made masters lose their minds. Others claimed Jordan had been so beautiful, so impossibly alluring that even good Christian people couldn't resist falling into sin. Still others whispered that Jordan hadn't done anything at all, except hold up a mirror to the ruddled souls, and they had destroyed themselves when they couldn't bear what they saw reflected there. The truth, as always, was more complicated and more mundane than legend allowed, but the legend served its purpose, reminding the enslaved that their masters were not invulnerable, that obsession and guilt could destroy even the most powerful, that sometimes survival itself was a kind of victory. Within a week of Catherine's funeral, Thomas made arrangements to sell Belmont Estate. He met with potential buyers, negotiated terms, accepted the first reasonable offer despite it being well below the property's actual value. He wanted only to be rid of the place as quickly as possible to put distance between himself and the site of his destruction. Before the sale was finalized, he did 3 things. First, he ordered the 3rd-floor room where Catherine had died sealed and locked. He had workers remove all the furniture, scrub the blood stains from the floorboards, though the stains never quite disappeared, no matter how hard they scrubbed. Then he had the door locked and the key thrown into the well with stipulations written into the sales contract that the room remains sealed in perpetuity. The buyer, a merchant from Petersburg, thought it an eccentric request, but agreed readily enough. What, pray, did he care about one locked room in a house with 20 others? Second, Thomas systematically destroyed every document related to Jordan. Bills of sale, medical records, personal journals, correspondence with Dr. Carriel. He built a fire in his study fireplace and fed the papers into it one by one, watching years of documentation turn to ash. He burned Catherine's diary too. Though he never read it first, he couldn't bear to see his own actions reflected through her eyes, to understand how she had experienced what they had done. Third, he sold most of the enslaved workers along with the property, dispersing them to different buyers across the county. Families were separated, communities broken apart, lives disrupted once again to serve the convenience of those who owned them. Thomas felt a distant guilt about this, understanding on some level that he was inflicting fresh trauma on people who had already endured so much. But guilt changed nothing. He needed money to start over, and slaves were property to be liquidated like any other asset. But he kept Jordan. When asked why, he had no good answer. Perhaps it was because Jordan was the only other person who truly understood what had happened, the only witness to his complete degradation. Perhaps it was because some part of him still felt that strange fascination, that need to possess what he couldn't understand. Or perhaps it was simply because he couldn't imagine Jordan belonging to anyone else, being subjected to another master's curiosity or cruelty. He moved to a small house in Lynchburg with just 3 slaves, Jordan and 2 elderly servants too old to fetch good prices at auction. It was a modest residence on a quiet street, nothing like the grandeur of Belmont. Thomas lived there like a hermit, rarely venturing out except for necessary errands, declining all social invitations, withdrawing completely from the world of Virginia's planter society that had once defined his entire existence. His neighbors occasionally saw him walking alone in the early morning hours, moving with the slow, shuffling gait of a much older man, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He spoke to no one, made no friends, participated in no community activities. He simply existed, going through the motions of living without any apparent purpose or pleasure. Jordan lived in a small room on the 2nd floor of the house, still legally Thomas's property, but no longer subject to the obsessive attention that had characterized their relationship at Belmont. They barely spoke to each other. When they did interact, it was with formal politeness, Thomas giving simple orders about household tasks, Jordan obeying with quiet efficiency. The terrible intimacy they had shared at Belmont was gone, replaced by a vast distance that neither could bridge even if they had wanted to. The relationship had transformed into something almost stranger than what had come before. They were master and slave in the eyes, praetii, of the law. But in practice, they were more like 2 ghosts haunting the same house, moving past each other without truly connecting, bound together by shared history neither could escape, but both desperately wanted to forget. Sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, Thomas would stand outside Jordan's door with his hand raised to knock, wanting something, understanding perhaps, absolution. Some acknowledgement that what had happened between them had been real, had mattered, had meant something beyond mere exploitation and destruction. But he never knocked. He would stand there for long minutes, his hand trembling in the air, then turn away and return to his own room without making a sound. Jordan, lying awake on the other side of that door, knew he was there, could hear his breathing, sense his presence, feel the weight of his unspoken need. But Jordan never opened the door, never offered the comfort or confrontation Thomas might have been seeking. There was nothing to say. That hadn't already been said, nothing to offer that could change what had happened or make it mean something other than what it was. The month passed slowly in that house of ghosts and silence. Thomas aged rapidly, his hair going gray, his face gaunt, his eyes taking on the hollow look of someone who had stopped seeing any purpose in continuing to exist. He drank, though not to excess, just enough to blur the edges of memory to make sleep possible on the nights when guilt and grief threatened to overwhelm him entirely. Thomas Ruddle died in his sleep on the morning of November 3, 1852, 9 months after Catherine's death. The physician who was called to examine the body found no obvious cause of death, no disease, no injury, no sign of poison or violence. His heart had simply stopped beating, as if he had decided during the night that living required more effort than he could muster, and his body had obligingly complied with that decision. Sometimes, the physician noted in his report, with the careful detachment of professional observation, a man can die of a broken spirit as surely as from a broken bone. The will to live is a mysterious thing, and when it departs, the body often follows soon after. I believe that is what happened here. Jordan was sold at auction, along with the other assets of Thomas's small estate, the house, the furniture, the 2 elderly servants. The slave went for $412, a fraction of what Thomas had originally paid, because by then rumors about Jordan's unusual nature had spread through the local community, and buyers were suspicious of anything connected to the Rutledge tragedy. The man who purchased Jordan was a farmer from Appomattox County who needed household help and didn't put much stock in what he dismissed as superstitious gossip. What became of Jordan afterward remains unknown. The historical record falls silent, just as it so often does for enslaved people whose lives were deemed unworthy of preservation. No additional bills of sale exist, no estate inventories, no court filings that clearly identify anyone matching Jordan's description. It is as if the person simply dissolved into the machinery of slavery itself, swallowed by a system that documented property but erased humanity. In the absence of records, only speculation remains. Perhaps Jordan escaped northward, slipping away during a moment of opportunity and disappearing into a world where a new name meant a new life. Perhaps survival came later, through the upheaval of the Civil War, or the long-awaited arrival of emancipation. Maybe there was a future built quietly somewhere else far from Belmont Estate where the past could not follow, and identity was no longer defined by ownership. Or perhaps not. Perhaps there was no escape at all. Perhaps Jordan's life continued under other owners, passed from one hand to another, always observed, always controlled, until it ended too soon in anonymity. The truth is lost to time, and history offers no resolution, only patience. That silence itself becomes its own answer, reflecting how many lives were never recorded, never acknowledged, and never restored. Belmont Estate stood abandoned for 3 years before being acquired by a merchant from Petersburg who intended to revive its fortunes. With his family, he moved in and began attempts to restore the property. But soon after settling, unsettling accounts began to surface. The sealed room on the upper floor disturbed those who passed it, an unnatural coldness lingering at its door even in summer heat. Some claimed to hear faint, unexplainable sounds from within, despite the room having been locked and untouched for years. Eventually, curiosity overcame caution. Against the original conditions of purchase, the new owner ordered the room opened. What the workers discovered inside was enough to silence them. The floorboards bore deep, dark stains that resisted every attempt at removal. The walls carried faint impressions of furniture long removed, and the air itself felt heavy, oppressive in a way no one could comfortably describe. Those who entered rarely stayed long enough to finish their work. The room was stripped bare, floors replaced, walls repainted. Every effort was made to erase what had been there, and yet something remained. The family who lived there afterward spoke of an unease they could never fully explain, a persistent feeling that the space still remembered what had happened within it. Over time, Belmont Estate passed through several more owners. None stayed long. Each left behind vague warnings, unspoken discomfort, and financial loss that they never fully justified. Whispers about the property spread through the region. Some spoke of sounds in the night, others of shifting shadows or an inexplicable dread that settled in certain rooms. Whether these accounts were fear, imagination, or something harder to define, no one could say with certainty. But the pattern remained the same. No one remained at Belmont for long. By 1865, in the final turbulence of the Civil War, as conflict swept across Virginia, The main house was destroyed by fire under circumstances that were never clearly explained. Some attributed it to passing soldiers, others believed local hands had ended what they considered an accursed place, and some insisted there was no human cause at all, that the estate had simply reached the end of whatever it had been holding inside itself. Only fragments remained, a foundation, a few broken structures, and scattered stonework slowly reclaimed by the land. Over time, even these faded beneath forest and overgrowth until almost nothing was left. Today, the location of Belmont Estate is barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. What remains is overgrown, largely forgotten, and marked only by weathered signs, discouraging entry signs that appear maintained, though no one can clearly say by whom. Local historians acknowledge that a plantation once stood there, associated with the Ruddled family, but much of its record is fragmented or missing entirely, as if parts of its history were deliberately removed from official memory. The sealed court documents connected to the Ruddled case remain incomplete, leaving more questions than answers. In the end, what survived